Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today titled Public Cloud Comparison 2020, the State of AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. Our speaker today is Myles Brown, Senior Cloud and DevOps Advisor at Tech Data ExitCertified. Myles has over 20 years of experience in the IT industry across a variety of platforms. Recognized as an AWS Authorized Instructor Champion and a Google Cloud Platform Professional Architect and Instructor, Myles has delivered award-winning authorized IT training for the biggest cloud providers. Before we get started with the webinar, let's go over the functionalities. During the webinar, everyone's microphones will be muted, so if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the lecture. We're also recording the webinar today, and we'll send each of you a link to that recording. Finally, at the end of the webinar, I'm going to share 2 promos, so stick around to learn more. All right, let's get started. Take it away, Myles.
Thanks, Michelle. So it looks like we have over 150 participants. So obviously we have to mute everybody. So yeah, like Michelle said, throw the questions up whenever you want. We will have a Q&A at the end, but if it's sort of, pertinent to what we're talking about at that point, throw it in and I'll try and answer them, in due time. Like Michelle said, I've been an instructor for both AWS and Google Cloud. And I'm pretty familiar with Microsoft Azure as well. And our company, ExitCertified, that's what we do is training. And we're partnered with these various vendors that we do their authorized training. And so it gives us a pretty good perspective on, the major cloud players. And so what we're going to talk about today, we'll do a quick little, a little bit of terminology up front around the models of cloud services and a quick overview of the cloud providers. And then we'll talk about, how they differ in infrastructure and some of the terminology they use around infrastructure, and then kind of make the case for each cloud provider. I kind of only put the pros of each, but you could kind of get the idea of the pros of one or might be the cons of the others. And then a little note about multi-cloud at the end. And what it is really a teaser for tomorrow's webinar, which is sort of the benefits and drawbacks of a multi-cloud strategy. And then some of the tooling that you might use to achieve that multi-cloud strategy. And Michelle will pop in at the end and talk a little bit about some of the promos that we have going. That'll be really quick, and then we'll leave the rest of the time for questions. So I mentioned that a bit of terminology, many of you are probably familiar with the idea of infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. Sometimes you'll hear people say PaaS or SaaS or something like that. But the big idea is, giving your cloud provider more responsibilities and, hence taking less of those responsibilities on yourself. So if you're going to run something in your own data center, it's all on you, right? From the data center itself to the hardware to all the way up the stack. When we move to the cloud, most people's introduction to the cloud is just saying, give me some virtual machines. I don't want to worry about hardware and leasing land and building a data center and all that kind of stuff. So you take care of, all the hardware, the virtualization, just give me a Linux or a Windows instance that I can use. And I can, log into it, manage the OS how I want, install whatever software I want. And that's what we call infrastructure as service, right? But then the cloud providers started adding on a lot of kind of higher level things where they say, well, what if you want an Oracle database or SQL Server or MySQL? Like a relational database is something almost everybody has. And so there's a lot of heavy lifting that everybody would have to do. And so they said, why don't you let us do more of that? So not only will we provide you with the virtual machine, we'll manage it. We'll manage the operating system, the file system. We'll install the database and manage that to a certain degree, right? And you just get a JDBC or an ODBC driver and you connect to it, but you're not really the DBA, right? And so that's sort of a database as a service, but there's lots of those kind of platform as a service. And so that's really where our public cloud providers mostly operate, is infrastructure and platform as a service. Now, they generally do provide some software as a service as well. And software as a service is, things like Salesforce.com, where, I don't manage anything. I just get some software and I can kind of, tweak it for my company and how I want it to look and stuff. But if you think about things like Office 365 or Google G Suite, those are very much software as a service, and AWS has similar kinds of options as well, maybe not as popular. So they kind of all get into that business as well. Maybe the one you haven't heard of is this concept. Oh, here's some examples of PaaS. So I kind of mentioned that idea of a relational database. So AWS has RDS, and that's a very common kind of platform as a service. Another one might be in Azure. They have Azure App Service. So especially if you're like a .NET shop and you're developing applications using .NET, and you say, here's my application, I want you to take care of everything as far as the infrastructure. Make it a nice, scalable, highly available web app, right? And so I can start from GitHub or something like that. There's my code, take it and go and launch everything. I don't want to think about scalability. I don't want to think about high availability. You just take care of it, right? And because Azure, is so nicely tied up with Microsoft products, they were able to do that for .NET really, really well. And so that's, kind of one of their big strengths. The newest sort of one of these would be the function as a service. Serverless compute, some people call it. And so in the AWS world, we have Lambda, right? Where as a developer, I provide code, but I don't have to think about the servers, the operating system. What if that, virtual machine dies? I might have to have multiple virtual machines working for high availability. And where do I deploy the code to? You don't think about any of that. You just say, here's my code, and here I'm going to configure what's the event that causes that code to run. So instead of launching a virtual machine that I have to manage physically and everything else, and pay for by the second or by the hour, depending on the instance type, instead I just say, here's the code, run it, and I'll pay in 100 millisecond increments for how long the function runs. Right? Now, AWS isn't alone in this. Azure has something called Azure Functions. Google Cloud has Google Cloud Functions. They're all kind of very similar. AWS is sort of, I think, probably the most mature of these, and it seems to be the most popular in that particular cloud. So let's talk a little bit about the three big cloud providers and maybe some of the other ones that we run into. AWS kind of really got the ball rolling in 2006, although some of their services predated that since 2004 even. So it's definitely the most popular and the most mature platform at this point, right? Azure and Google Cloud came along in 2010 and 2011 respectively. So they had to do some catch up. And Microsoft has done a pretty good job of catching up. It's definitely the second most popular. It's really great if you're a total Microsoft shop. So if you're doing development, you're doing .NET development. When you use a relational database, it's probably SQL Server, things like that. Google Cloud is very popular with machine learning and artificial intelligence crowd. And we'll talk a little bit about why. Now we look, other traditional vendors like IBM and Oracle, they have their own clouds, but they are sort of a little bit more niche and their usage is really dropping. So if we look at sort of how the industry views these various providers, and we'll take just the last few years. We'll start in 2017. Gartner puts out this Magic Quadrant every year. So this was in June 2017. AWS was way up top. Microsoft was the only other one in that leader category, and Google was sort of making their way up. And then you had things like Alibaba, IBM, and Oracle were also in the sort of visionary category. But then you had all these traditional things like take Rackspace, for example. They were early on a big player in this cloud market. But they were sort of getting beaten so badly that they had to pivot their whole business model, right? So they still do a little bit of, they have some cloud capacity, they run cloud stuff, but mostly what they've done is change their business model to become a managed service provider for people who are doing AWS stuff, right? So that's, it's the, if you can't beat them, join them kind of idea. Well, Gartner eventually, it looked like this for a few years before 2017. And when they went to 2018, they said, let's just forget all of these ones and zoom in just on the major players. And so now you kind of see AWS and Microsoft, and Google, snuck its way into the leaders. And then you've got these others. Now, Alibaba Cloud, we're not going to talk much about because I think that most of the people on the call are probably North American based. That's our, as ExitCertified, that's mainly our client base. And they really only operate in China. And so we're going to talk really about the big three. Right? And what we see is moving from, about a year, 2 years ago to almost a year ago in 2019, Google has moved up a little bit more. Microsoft's kind of getting closer in terms of completeness of vision, right? They're all kind of getting closer into what is the breadth of services that they offer. But AWS is still, maybe highest in the ability to execute, right? And so that's kind of what Gartner looks at. What about market share, right? Market share is really tough to determine because not all the providers will say, here's how much business we've done, right? But this Canalys is a company that does all kinds of analytics, and they just came out with their report in January, and they said, here's our estimates, right? So some of the companies like AWS, it's a separate company, and so you can actually look and see what is their business look like. But Azure, it's a little more difficult because it's all tied up. When they report Azure earnings, it's along with Office 365 and Teams and a few other things. So it's hard to kind of figure it out. Google Cloud, same thing. It's kind of Google Cloud and G Suite, but then they look and see what are they saying about how the split is. And so this is roughly kind of what the numbers are at now. I think I've seen other numbers from other estimates that have Google Cloud as high as 8%, but this was this estimate, and it's gone up from last year. Everybody's growing, right? But if you look, AWS is growing at a 36% rate, but look at what Azure and Google Cloud are doing. So Google Cloud, I think in particular, has made some big strides in the last year and a half, right? It was a big push from Google. They've got deep pockets, and if they want to spend money on making their cloud a real player, and which it seems they are, we're seeing some real changes. By the way, if I mistakenly say GCP today, it's a habit because it was generally called Google Cloud Platform, but just in the last few weeks, they've really started to shift and drop the platform. And so it's just called Google Cloud at this point. And then you got the others, right? And if you look at the market share of the others, it was 44.8%, and now it's 40.1%. So just in a year, they've sort of lost a lot of market share. So that's things like IBM and Oracle, where people are not necessarily. We have a question. Will these slides be made available after to the webinar people? Actually, no, I'm not going to share the slides, but they will be in the recorded version. So you'll be able to see those. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit about market share. You can easily go and find this if you just look up Canalys. Yeah, that's how you say it. Canalys, cloud market share or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about the big three, right? And we'll start with AWS, then we'll look at Azure, then we'll look at Google Cloud. And we'll start first with the sort of global infrastructure. And so, for many of you that have been playing with clouds, you're probably familiar with these terms, right? So if you look at the AWS in global infrastructure, they have a bunch of data centers, and they're generally like clustered really close together. And they call that cluster of data centers an availability zone. So the rest of this webinar, I might say AZ, think, okay, that's a cluster of data centers so close together that they sort of appear as one. And then what they'll do is a few miles away, they'll build another cluster, right? So maybe a few towns over, they'll make another cluster of data centers. And the idea is that they'll build like 2 or 3 of these AZs, and together that's what they call a region. Right? And the thinking is that these AZs are close enough together that Amazon could put very low latency, like high throughput lines between them so that they can replicate data between them pretty quickly, but far enough apart that if there's some sort of localized disaster, it might take out this group of data centers, but not these ones over here. Right? And so that's really the big thinking. They do all kinds of things to try and make them really independent. They'll put them on different floodplains or different sides of fault lines, or even connect them to different electricity grids if possible. But certainly they have different independent power and generators and all that kind of thing. And if you want to see, exactly what the AWS current infrastructure looks like, I put a link in here and I'll just click on it. They have 22 regions with 70 AZs, unless something changed today. I went and updated that yesterday. 70 availability zones, 22 regions. And if I scroll down far enough, you'll see a map that looks like this. And then you see there's sort of these orange ones coming soon. And usually if you kind of roll over top of one, it'll say how many AZs are there in the Ireland, it's the 3. The biggest one and the oldest one is the one in Northern Virginia. That's where they really started. It's got 6 availability zones. Not that you need that many, it's just they have a lot of work there, right? And so that's sort of what Amazon's infrastructure looks like. Now, let's get back to what Azure looks like. So Azure also has a concept of regions, but they have 50. So think about that, 50 versus 22. The problem is what they call a region could be as small as 1 data center. Now, think about less than a dozen of their regions are also decomposed into what they call multiple availability zones, right? They also have another kind of grouping they call regions into geographies, like say all the regions in the US, that's a geography that all share the same sort of data residency and data sovereignty and compliance kind of rules. And they have their own kind of infrastructure page that looks like this. I think if I go to regions, you'll see the map. And so one of the things that AWS did was they got into a lot of countries really quickly because they could build a region and say, oh, we've got a region, like say I'm in Canada, right? I'm Canadian, and they have Canada East and Canada Central. And they got in pretty early because for them, a region might be just 1 data center, right? Whereas it took AWS a little longer to get into Canada because when they build a region, it's, at least 2 AZs, and it's a pretty, so even though they have 2 regions in Canada, is that more highly available than 1 region in AWS? It's hard to say, right? I would suggest maybe the AWS concept of a region is certainly more robust, right? And so there's some differences in terminology there to really be aware of. All right, so that's AWS, and the way Google set theirs up, it's very, very similar to how AWS does. They have about 20 regions, 67 zones. They just call them zones, but it's basically an AZ. Google's also very vocal about the vast network that they have. The other providers really didn't talk much about their network until maybe after Google started really boasting, hey, Google's got an amazing network, which they do. But eventually AWS started to say, oh, if you want to see, you're not going over the internet if you're moving data from one region to another. We've got our own dedicated lines across most of the world. But here's the AWS, the Google Cloud setup, 22 regions, 67 zones, and, kind of a similar. So you get the feeling like, okay, they're all kind of very similar in terms of what that infrastructure looks like. There are some differences between terminology, and I think what Azure calls a region, is really kind of a little suspect compared to the others, right? But beyond just, the infrastructure, what is the big case for each vendor, right? So we'll start with AWS. And, the biggest selling point there is that it is wildly popular, right? It's the oldest, it's the most popular. They have the most practitioners out there using the platform. So when it comes to hiring, it's a little easier to find somebody who knows AWS than Google Cloud. There's more people with certifications, all that kind of thing. I think what they do really well is building a highly available system. So if you look at any of the kind of aggregators of downtime on the web, what you'll find is that AWS generally has the least amount of downtime of the big 3. Azure is probably the worst when it comes to this. Now, when AWS does have some sort of incident, the whole world talks about it because half the internet doesn't work. That's when you realize how powerful and how popular AWS is, when you go to every website that day and nothing works because they're all using AWS under the covers. It doesn't happen very often. There's been a couple of high-profile ones. Probably the last biggest one was, February 2017, and before that it was like December 2012, where we had a big incident that, really, affected a lot of people. I think they also are best in overall in breadth and depth of services. They have over 175 services across, you name it, right? And I think one of their hotspots that they do well is the serverless side. So, if you want to take some monolithic application, break it up into microservices, a lot of people are increasingly using Lambda to implement each of the microservices. And then you put like a RESTful web service in front of it using something like API Gateway. And if you have lots of Lambdas that together are going to, coordinate to do some task, then you could use their step functions. So they built a whole stack of these things. It's not that, Azure and Google Cloud don't have these kind of functions, but I don't think it's quite the robust platform for it. So that's sort of the case for AWS, right? They do sort of everything pretty well. Right now, there are some hotspots where people would prefer Azure or Google Cloud, but I think that that idea that they do everything pretty well. Jeff mentions that Netflix had 3 major downtimes that I'm aware of, all related to AWS. Their Northern Virginia site. I remember that one. The first one was that December 26th, 2012, when that Northern Virginia region went down for quite a while because there weren't that many people working. It was the holidays. And Netflix wasn't available for like a whole day or something. And, that's when you need it most, when you're trapped at home with your family and Netflix wasn't available. People were very vocal on Twitter about it. After that, Netflix went to much more of a multi-region setup. So they did learn from that, but they definitely have some problems when a whole region goes down. Right? So yeah. All right. What about Azure? Well, for a lot of organizations, a lot of enterprises, they're already, they've already got agreements with Microsoft, or they might be using Office 365. So it's kind of easy to add on the cloud. It's not like some extra new vendor they have to vet and get on their list of providers and everything. So it's usually an easy path for them. And I mentioned earlier, they have a really great PaaS offering for not just .NET, they've added some other languages, but because they were so focused on Microsoft stuff early on, they do a really good job of managing that stuff, right? Later, they started to add support for, what if I've got a Python app, whereas Amazon, it doesn't go as deep in their PaaS offerings because they're sort of more worried about generically any kind of application, right? So that it's a little different focus. The other thing that Azure really embraced well was that idea of a hybrid kind of model where you're going to run some things on-prem and some things in the cloud. And they said, if you want to run your on-prem stuff just the same as the cloud, you can use something called Azure Stack. And that's where you actually buy from Microsoft, like hardware and software. And so you have a private cloud that's in your own data set, but you're managing it the same way as Azure stuff. And then you can just decide which workloads stay local, which ones go into the cloud, right? And you're using sort of one pane of glass. Okay? Now, after that came out, that was sort of the big one for hybrid, and everyone liked that idea. AWS now has something called AWS Outposts. It's pretty expensive. I've only seen a few customers. We do some very specialized training around that, and I've only seen a few customers that are using it. But you can buy these hardware, like these huge racks from Amazon, put them in your data center, and then you can run basically AWS services in your own data center. But it doesn't seem as popular. It's not as widely available, it seems, as Azure. And we'll see what Google Cloud has done for their sort of idea. Oh, Brett's asking, how does Azure Stack compare to AWS Outposts in terms of cost, reliability, ease of use? I think cost of Azure Stack is much cheaper than AWS Outposts, because I know that it is super expensive. As far as reliability, ease of use, I'm not sure. I think the AWS Outpost reliability is probably very good, but that's a guess. I don't do that specialized Outpost training, so I don't think I could really tell you exactly on those, but I think the price is one that is pretty obvious. Sam asks, are there any particular market segments that prefer AWS over any other service? Well, I think it's kind of interesting. It's sort of like they kind of all seek out at least a few companies from each industry, just because, they want to have that list of logos, and they want logos that cover all the industries, right? So you look even in financial, you'll see banks and stuff that use AWS and some that use Azure, some that use a Google Cloud. So I don't know if it's exactly, but I think one thing around it is probably compliance, right? So certain types of compliance are maybe easier to get in AWS. Sometimes if you're trying to get a certain compliant workload, if you're the first person trying to get that kind of compliance in that cloud provider, you're going to have to work with them and try and, your auditors for compliance are going to have to go in and help them figure out, are their data centers compliant with this, right? Now, that was early on, you had to do that a lot. But nowadays, if you walk into AWS and say, okay, I want to build a compliant workload for, whatever compliance body, chances are there's a bunch of other organizations already doing that. And so you can take the accreditations and everything. And that's usually your fastest path to compliance, is to say, I'm already using data centers that are certified as this. And so it's just my application that I have to worry about. And so it's wildly popular in US federal government. I would say AWS is very, very popular. Now we're seeing Azure a little bit more, and especially with the JEDI kind of contract, who knows what happens with that in real life, but I think we're starting to see Azure get in there. Azure also was able to, like I said, get into a bunch of countries before others, and so that was kind of a big deal for them. Actually, that's my next point probably. Yeah, they had a presence in many countries before others, and so because of data sovereignty issues, they were able to get certain kinds of compliance that the other vendors couldn't get because they didn't have a presence in that country. Right, so I think when you look at country-specific kind of compliance, Azure probably has a little bit more of a market segment there. So hopefully I've answered that. Now let's look at Google Cloud. Like I mentioned, Google Cloud is very much a third, or even depending whose numbers you look at, might even be behind Alibaba Cloud. But they're growing. They're really growing. And where they've always been kind of strong is with people who are really heavily into machine learning, right? Google, they do a lot of innovation in machine learning, right? And they built TensorFlow. And so you can use TensorFlow in Azure or AWS. They all have machine learning capabilities, of course. But Google Cloud seems to do the best job of it. And so that's sort of one hotspot where what I'm finding now is I've got customers who've been using AWS for years, and now they're looking at Google Cloud and saying, I like their analytics more, so I'm going to use both. Right? I'll take my data out of S3 in AWS, and I'll bring it over to Google Cloud just to use their analytics tools. Right? And so that's sort of, they've been innovating in that for many, many years, and you're really building on the strength of all of that expertise. The other thing they did, they embrace a lot of open source stuff. They built Kubernetes, right, which is the most popular container orchestration tool. And they do a really great job of managing that in the cloud, right? So Kubernetes is, if you've got Docker containers or any kind of containers, eventually if you build a complex enough setup, you're going to have thousands of containers to manage. And so a container orchestration framework takes care of that. And Kubernetes is sort of like the de facto standard now. It's not the only option, but it's become the most popular. And all three of the big AWS, Azure, they all have some sort of managed Kubernetes service. But AWS spent a lot of time building their own called ECS, the Elastic Container Service. And then eventually they said, oh, you know what? Everybody prefers Kubernetes, so let's go build that. And so it was sort of an afterthought, and it's getting better, but it's not quite there. And Azure has something called Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. But none of those are as good as the Google Kubernetes Engine, GKE. And so that's really, if you're really into Kubernetes, but you don't want to manage that sort of control plane, you let the cloud provider manage that. And so they're pretty good at that. The other thing Google has is probably the best pricing, right? So first off, for a long time, AWS only did per hour pricing for EC2 instances, whereas, Google Cloud and Azure came in with per minute and then per second billing. And so, depending on your workloads, you could save some money there, but really just the price point in general, I think, is lower with Google Cloud. But it's really hard to figure out pricing for a given customer, it might be better off with AWS, because if they know they're going to be using a lot, you get some pretty good bargaining power when you go to Amazon and say, let's make an enterprise agreement. I know we're going to use this much of this service, so give me a really good price, right? So you can be pretty sure that Netflix isn't paying 2.3 cents per gig for S3 storage, right? Because they're storing a lot of stuff in there, right? How much are they paying? Who knows, right? You got to look at that enterprise agreement, right? And there's all kinds of volume discounts as well, just out of the box, even without a special enterprise agreement. So it's really hard to figure out who's actually got the best pricing on a particular service. But the feeling that most people have is that Google Cloud's probably a little cheaper. Will IBM Power Systems running in GCP improve IBM's position as a certified hybrid cloud provider now based on RHEL and Kubernetes? Yeah, that's a good question. So IBM purchased Red Hat, whenever that was, a year and a half ago, something like that. And why they did it was because they really liked the sort of DevOps and cloud kind of capabilities that Red Hat was really getting into, right? And the idea that they had Ansible now built into RHEL, and all these kinds of ideas, and OpenShift, right? The way that OpenShift can be this nice tool for managing applications in the cloud, and really in any cloud. I think that we're going to see IBM's position as this change a little bit. And I don't know a lot about their hybrid plans. So I think my gut instinct, Larry, is that yes, I think we'll see some more interesting IBM hybrid stuff. But the answer is I don't really know. But I know that they know that that's the future, and that's why they spent a lot of money buying Red Hat. And it wasn't so much for Red Hat Linux. It was for the other products around it. Okay? The other question we have is how popular is having a multi or hypercloud? I think maybe you meant hybrid cloud environment. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end. Okay? So last thing about Google Cloud, they do have a hybrid environment, sort of a multi-cloud or hybrid environment called Anthos. And at Google Cloud Next, which is their big conference last year, they really pushed this. And what you really got from Google Cloud was this idea that, hey, don't put all your eggs in one basket. They know that they're third place, and what they're really trying to do is cut into AWS's market share. So their whole marketing campaign was, let Google Cloud be your second cloud provider, and let's figure out ways to make applications that can run in any cloud. And so Anthos is really all built on top of Kubernetes, but they have a way to run things on your own on-prem data center, in your own private cloud, or in any public cloud, really. And so that's sort of their twist on it, right? Now, I remember the Google Cloud Next was supposed to be last week. It got canceled, obviously, all these conferences. They were going to switch to a digital, then they just scrapped it. So I don't know when that's going to come back up. That's why I put this week, because I thought, well, if there's any new insights from Google Cloud Next, I'll be able to get them into my presentation. Unfortunately, the only kind of thing I got out of doing a trainer conference last week is that they're dropping the platform in Google Cloud Platform. So I don't have any new insights from last week, which I thought I might. But last year, it was really clear that they were pushing this idea of multi-cloud. And then I went to an AWS event right after, and Andy Jassy, the head of AWS, he basically said, hey, don't spread your spend around all these different cloud providers, right? Then you lose your bargaining power with the cloud. But it was an obvious reaction to that marketing from Google Cloud. But it's worth talking about multi-cloud. And I don't really have time today to get into it, but let's do this much. This was a big state of the cloud report that RightScale did last year. They interviewed a whole bunch of IT people and kind of polled them on all these questions. RightScale got bought by Flexera, so now it's from Flexera. But basically, of all the people, respondents, companies with more than 1,000 employees, they asked them, do you have a multi-cloud strategy? 84% of them did. But when they looked at multi-cloud, it was really mostly hybrid cloud. So that means they have some kind of private cloud. A lot of people have, say, VMware, right? And then they also have some things in one of the big public cloud providers. And so hybrid cloud is usually, you consider kind of a way to ease into using public cloud, maybe while maintaining your existing investment, right? So some companies say, no, that's it. Let's shut all our data centers. We're going into the cloud right now. But most people say, well, I've got an existing investment. Let's wait until these data centers are old and need to get refreshed, and then we'll move totally into the cloud, right? And for a lot of people, if you are using something like VMware, you can use the same tools you are using to manage VMware clusters in your on-prem environment. They also have sort of VMware on AWS, and then an Azure solution, so that you can, from the same pane of glass, just decide this workload, should it run on one of my machines physically or run in Amazon's data center, right? And you also hear of this term cloud bursting, where people say, I'm primarily running workloads on my private cloud, but I'm utilizing a public cloud provider for excess capacity. And a great example of that is Zoom, right? Zoom has all their own data centers, but when it gets busy, they go into both Azure and AWS now. You can imagine that over the last month, they've had to do that quite a bit. I've been so impressed with Zoom, though. We've been using Zoom since it first came out. We've been doing virtual training since 2012 through what we call our IMVP. But part of our IMVP, the client, is a Zoom client like you're using right now for this webinar. And, I'd say probably about 4 weeks ago, when most people had to start working from home, we saw a little glitch on that Monday. But we run classes starting Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Usually it's like, 5-day, 4-day, 3-day classes. And that was the only glitch really we saw with Zoom, which is amazing, because they do such a good job of bursting into the cloud when they need excess capacity. But what you will see here under this hybrid multi-cloud, there's like 58% of them are doing hybrid. But look at this, multiple public clouds, 17%. That number keeps coming up every year. So increasingly, customers want to use multiple public vendors to avoid lock-in. And also, like I mentioned, take advantage of the sweet spots of each one. So I mostly like AWS, but for analytics, I want to do some Google Cloud. If you're interested in this idea of multi-cloud, what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks, what are some of the tools that people are using to make this work, we got another webinar tomorrow, same time, noon Eastern, called Benefits and Drawbacks of Multi-Cloud Strategy. I got that link up here. I think probably Michelle will put that link into the chat if you want to grab it. It's definitely not too late. Oh, she put the whole thing in there, yeah. It's definitely not too late to sign up for that one. And just before we take some questions, I've got this information on some of our Exit Certified stuff. So just to plug us really quickly, we are an authorized training provider of all 3 public clouds, but also IBM and Oracle as well, right? That's our company. We mostly partner with big vendors and deliver their training programs, typically in either one of our training centers across North America, which are all temporarily closed, but our virtual training is wildly popular. And like I said, it's based on Zoom, but we have a producer there to take care of, AV problems first thing, make sure everybody's got their kits. And so classes go really smoothly. And we really encourage this idea of a two-way video, not like we're doing here in a webinar, but, we encourage it. It feels more like a classroom when you see everybody. And if you look at the curriculum across the 3, they kind of all have like a 1 or a 2-day fundamentals kind of, hey, let's learn the basics. And then usually there's a 3 or 4-day or 5-day in terms in Azure, sort of an architecture class, which is sort of the main class. For Google Cloud, the architecture class is both the architect and administration. In AWS, we've got separate 3-day classes for architecture or sysops, or even a developer one. Azure has a bunch of different paths. So we've got some learning paths in our website as well. I'm updating them because we just had a bunch of new classes come out across most of the vendors. So we're in the middle of updating those. And we have some promos. Maybe, Michelle, you can tell us a little bit about the promos.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're super excited to announce our Spring 20 promo. This is an opportunity to save up to 20% on select training from now until, or if you register from now until April 17th. We
Ooh,
also
that's pretty
have,
tight.
it is.
Is that
So
Friday?
that's on Friday.
Okay, but we have some other promos.
We do. So we also have a refer a friend promo. So this is your opportunity to attend a course, refer a friend or a colleague, get yourself up to $100 with an Amazon gift card, and your referred friend will save 15% on their training.
Okay, that's pretty good. And you put some links in around, the AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud training. And then you'll put something about the refer a friend.
Definitely. So the links to AWS, Azure, and cloud training are in the chat window for everyone. The spring promo code is also in the chat, and that link is going to bring you to our promo page. So click on that link. It's going to bring you over to our promo page where you can learn all the details about the refer your friend promo.
Okay. We had a question in the chat. I'll take that one. What certifications does the AWS training cover? Yeah, that's a good point. So let's go take a quick look at our website, and we got sections on both the courses themselves. So if I go to training and AWS, you'll see basically just the courses where they don't mention much about the certification in there. But we also have under certification, you'll see Microsoft, Google Cloud, and AWS. So if I click on AWS, it kind of talks about the various certifications, and you can read more information about those. I think probably the best thing, though, is if you go find one of our learning path documents. Like I said, I'm in the middle of updating these, so we'll look at the AWS one. It's not exactly up to date, but I'm about to fix it. So these learning path documents, I'm sort of the one that runs these. Kind of take you through different kinds of roles. So if you're a cloud operations or administrator person, we generally say take the one-day tech essentials. Now, if you've been using AWS for a while, you can skip that and go straight to the SysOps class. And so, this assumes you're either comfortable in Linux or Windows administration. When you get to the labs, you can use one or the other. And that's a 3-day class. And between those two, that gets you pretty well prepared for the associate SysOps administrator certification, right? Similarly with the architect, it's a 1-day plus a 3-day class, gets you pretty well ready for the associate. And then same thing down here for developer. So those are the 3 associate level certifications. And then there is an advanced, what they call architect professional. So there's a 3-day class you would take to help get towards that. Same thing for either the developer or the SysOps. You could take the DevOps engineering to get you ready for the DevOps. Now, a question about the training. Which training is in highest demand between the big 3? It's a question from Eric. Yeah, it's definitely AWS. What we find is that Microsoft has MS Learn, and they're starting to add more content in there, so it's kind of freely available. But some people prefer, having access to a live instructor that you can ask questions of, right? And so, but AWS, it follows the market. They've got the biggest market, so it's the biggest market for training as well. Somebody asked about the learning paths. Yeah, okay, there. So Michelle put the learning path URL in there, and from there you can pick which one you want. So let's, and then there's more specialty things like the big data and the data warehousing, and so there's all sorts of certifications. So any of the certifications that AWS has, we've got courses that sort of correspond. There is a new, what they call AWS Data Analytics. It was the big data specialty. It's now called the Data Analytics specialty. You got the impression it's not very popular. Well, it's hard to achieve is the problem, right? So those associate level ones, and I think it probably goes for the Google Cloud, that they call the ACE, the Associate Certified Engineer, and even some of the entry level like Microsoft certifications. That first level of certification, if you take the courses, you do a little bit of study, you should be able to pass. But then if you get to the later ones, the professional, or in AWS, they have professional and specialty exams, you have to have such a breadth of knowledge. And the problem is, I've been using, somebody comes in, they say, oh, I've been using AWS for 2-3 years. you're like, yeah, but you've been using this set of services. You haven't been using the full breadth. And so you get into questions where you're like, I've never used that. So by taking the class, it gives you, if you're using the class for prep, it'll give you, breadth of knowledge that you might need. But a lot of people just don't attempt those ones because they know they are difficult. Like if you go into any of those kind of like forums where people talk about certification, they're like, oh man, I failed that 5 times, and that's sort of one of the problems that we run into. But I think that the certification, certainly on the AWS side, I see it a lot that, consultancies or companies that want to get higher in the AWS partner network, they need to have so many people with professional or specialty certifications. So that's sort of one of the things that we run into is that, the partner levels in the partnership, that drives certification, which drives people coming to our training. So let's step back from training. A couple of other questions. Nick asks, any key differences between the providers related to commitment pricing, reserved instance, savings plans, etc.? They all have some options for that, right? If you look at, say, Google Cloud, it's not a commitment you have to make up front, right? They just look at your usage and they say, hey, you've used a lot of Google Cloud, let's give you a volume discount on how much you spent on compute. Whereas with AWS, if you want to save money over the regular on-demand rate, then you're going to either have to do reserved instances where you say, I'm going to commit to a 1 or a 3-year term, up front. I can either pay all up front or just pay monthly. And hopefully, if I use this more than 60 or 70% of the month, I'll get a pretty good discount, right? But if I only use it a couple hours a month, I paid for, a lot. So I think that there's definitely some differences between them. I think that with AWS and the way the reserved instances work, it takes a little bit more planning. But now they have something called savings plans, which are a little bit influenced by how Google Cloud did things. And so, what we see is over time, they have some real differences, but they all get closer and closer together. So yeah, there's definitely differences. What we find, I saw a nice research done into it saying how many people are taking advantage of these things. And it's weird that people are not taking advantage and they're just paying the regular on-demand rate, and that's basically a retail rate. And the old saying, retail is for suckers, right? Like if you know what you're doing, you can get cheaper access to virtual machines. All right. From a security perspective, which cloud provider has the most robust controls / tools? I mean, there's so many security perspectives, right? Like, are we talking data security or access controls? I mean, it really, the answer almost always is it depends. Like I think if you are a company that really already embraces Active Directory and use that for everything, and that's the way you do your administration or whatever, then probably Azure might fit nicely with what you do. Not that you can't use Active Directory in AWS, but it might be easier. When it comes to just like a lot of services in each of these providers, they all have a lot of services. I think that AWS probably has the most. But some of those were, they stole ideas from what Azure was doing. Like Azure, I think, was early on with adding machine learning in to say, hey, I've looked at these files and, it looks like these are, social security numbers. They probably should be encrypted or something, and just using machine learning to look at your data and make some suggestions to you. And then all of a sudden Amazon had that in their services, right? So you see these sort of things kind of, they all pull the best ideas from one another. I don't know, from a security perspective, I didn't mention that as the selling point of any one of the three, because I think all three of them, security is probably the biggest focus, right? Because none of these three companies can afford to have people say, this cloud is insecure, right? Otherwise, they lose all of their business, right? So I think that they all have pretty good controls. So I don't think that that's the big, what it really comes down to is, do they have the right controls for you? And, you know, do they have the right compliance for you? And I think that's more often the question, right? Jerry asks, what do the job prospects look like after getting these certifications? I would say that I saw a survey done, you know, for many years. When you look at which are the most valuable IT certifications, you know, those AWS certifications were right up near the top. I just saw the Google Cloud one pop up higher than that last year. But I think that I think that the AWS advanced certifications are the ones, like, if you just want to say, if I have this certification, will that be enough to get me a job? I mean, if I'm looking to hire somebody, I'd rather have somebody that has experience than just a certification, right? But if I'm looking at a bunch of people with experience, the one that has certification, that's important, right? And we're not talking about that entry-level certification, right? AWS has a cloud practitioner certification, which, you know, some of our salespeople have it, right? It basically asks the question, can you spell AWS? If so, congrats, you're certified, right? But to get the professional certification, you really have to know, you know, pretty well how AWS works. And I remember when I first got my my DevOps engineer certification, I put that on my LinkedIn. The next day, a bunch of headhunters, you know, recruiters came looking for me, right? It was that bad, because what happens is, like I said, a bunch of companies need a certain number of people with associate and professional certifications, and specialty ones too. And it's, there people go for them and fail them, right? It's easy, you know, if they can go hire somebody that has it, then that instantly makes them available for that next level. And so I think that advanced certifications are, you know, very good for getting you a job, but having just a certification versus like no experience, that's not great, you know. And having just the entry-level certification probably isn't enough. The associate, I mean, I know that when we're looking to hire, you know, we would prefer somebody who has, you know, certifications from multiple vendors. So if you can get an associate certification from AWS and then get an Azure and or a GCP one, you know, all of a sudden you become that much more valuable, because so many organizations, if they're not doing it now, they're thinking multi-cloud somewhere down the road, and they don't want to have to go and skill people up, you know, starting from scratch. Right. All right, that's good questions. Oh, what about the accelerator course somebody asked about? Oh, yeah. So basically, you know, AWS had that 3-day architecting and then a 3-day advanced architecting. And people kept asking, hey, can you jam those together? Usually for private, like, you know, I got a group of 12 people. And so we bring the instructor in, you know, a lot of times, or we do it virtual just for you. And they want custom. They say, hey, can you take these 2 3-day classes, jam them together in 1 week? And we say, yeah, we can figure out how to do that. But the 2 classes were not built perfectly for one another, right? The advanced was really more of like a workshop, you know, assuming people have been using AWS for a while, then they come in and it's more of a workshop style, but we do cover some topics. And so people kept asking for it, and we kept telling Amazon, hey, people want this. And so they came up with a 5-day class that has all the content from the architecting and the advanced architecting in one 5-day class. Now, if you're coming in off the street never using AWS and you think you're going to take that and go write the professional certification, you're dreaming, right? Like it's you know, after that, you could probably easily go and get the associate, but you're still going to need to do a pretty good amount of study before you're ready for that professional, just because the breadth of knowledge you need and how cold you need to know it because of the time constraint of those professional ones. You know, at least it'll get you started, but then you'll have to do a lot of self-study. Right? All right, well, questions seem to be slowing down. I talked a little bit about the AWS learning path. I guess if we go back a level, I can show you the other ones. Like I said, they're sort of all being worked on right now. One of the things that we found is that Microsoft Azure, just in the last 2 weeks, they've come out with new versions of their classes. So in here, we talk about the, what's an example? Oh no, we have updated this one. Yeah, the 103 became the 104. the 203 became the 204. Oh, hey, this one's up to date. All right. So that's, this is the Azure kind of pass. Now, they have two different versions of their, new coming into AWS. They have the AZ 900. It's the Azure Fundamentals. And there is an exam if you want to get that one. They have a one-day class that has no labs and a two-day class that has labs. And by far, the two-day class is preferable, right? Because it gets you some hands-on. It really, sinks in, the fundamentals. Do we have any insight into how companies retain talent as they achieve these certifications? Yeah, that's a good question, right? So some companies look at certifications and they say, well, if I get somebody certified, well, I just made them more valuable on the open market, they're going to go somewhere else, right? And so there's some people that look at that and they say, I don't want to pay for you to be skill up and get a new job, right? But most of the companies that we work with have sort of got that idea that, well, if we're not paying for them to get better at their job, then they'll just leave and do that somewhere else. And the other idea is that the act of getting certified, makes you better at that product, right? Because a lot of times what happens is, with sort of on-the-job training, you say, oh, okay, we're going to use AWS, and here's how we do it. And so you use like these 10 services. And you have no exposure to all these other services, so you don't know what they are. You don't know what you don't know, right? But if you go to a certification or just a training class in general, not even specifically for certification, but you go to a training class and we say, hey, we're going to teach you about all these services. And you're like, well, we only use these ones. You're like, maybe you should be using these ones, right? And so that's sort of, you might have only used these ones in the past, but there's new ones all the time, right? And so taking certified training from the vendor, things are updated fairly quickly. And therefore, you're going to learn about the newer stuff. So I would say that just taking the training class will make you better. And if you've got a company that's willing to invest in you, then why are you going somewhere else? You know what I mean? So I don't have any actual, hard numbers. I just know that companies, there are some companies that view that like paying for the certification part. They say, no, we'll pay for training to get you better at your job. If you want to get certified, that's on your own time, right? But taking the training makes you better at your job. And then there's other companies that say, hey, if you stay here, we're going to invest in the training and give you certification. And so, that makes you happier, right? So I think there's sort of both ways to look at it. Betty, yes, is the recording of the session going to be available? Yes, that'll be sent out to you, I don't know, tomorrow?
End of this week.
End of this week. Okay, good. All right. Well, we're at the top of the hour. I got 1 o'clock, so I don't see any more questions popping in. But if you do have any questions, I've got my email address right here. It's myles.brown@techdata.com. You can send me questions if they're really about like, hey, I want to register for a course or something. I'll redirect you to one of our salespeople. But if you just want to ask some questions about cloud in general, you can pop them in there. Maybe we can throw that in the to all. Yeah, here I'll just put that email address in here. Myles.brown@techdata. Yeah, that looks right. Okay, so you can grab that. Otherwise, like I said, there is that free webinar, same time tomorrow. If you want to register for that, you can find that link somewhere in the chat. Now, when you go to leave, you're going to lose the chat. If you want, in the chat, there's a button, a dot button, and it says save chat. So you can save the chat, and then you have all those links available to you. Otherwise, thanks very much, and good luck in your cloud endeavors. And like I said, if you're interested at all in the multi-cloud, come back tomorrow.
Awesome. Thanks, Myles. Thank you, everyone, for spending some time with us today, and hopefully see you tomorrow.
Yeah, let's just give them a couple seconds if they're saving their chat or something.